So now let's have a look at some of those adaptive problems in a bit more detail. Let's focus first on status competition. So who should lead us? Evolutionary psychologists have argued that there are at least two evolutionary strategies for status competition in order to get to the top of a social hierarchy. These two strategies are often called dominance versus prestige. So dominance is using brute force in order to move to the top, and then requiring submission by your followers. So it's a rather, as the name says, dominant, aggressive, hostile way to obtain social status. A second one is based on prestige, so leading through example and moving up in the social hierarchy by creating admiration and support by others. So people support individuals and trust them, and therefore they move to the top of the social hierarchy. So these two strategies can be both useful and adaptive, but what our ancestral mind often makes of them can be shifted through situational cues. And this is where we're going to look at what we need to look at right now. The first thing is there's a little cottage industry of studies that are very interesting that argues that these strategies can be inferred from, for example, facial features. Their argument is that there are specific features in our face that can give us cues about the tendency of individuals to either be dominant or potentially more trustworthy, so therefore more prestigious in a way. These cues have to do, if we look at what they have to do with, for example, the eyebrows, how our eyebrows are being shaped, if they're, for example, turned slightly downwards, which often means or is supposed to signal um, more aggression, so less trustworthiness, and upturned eyebrows and also the mouth typically suggests a more friendly face. Again, more a signal towards prestige and higher trust and lower dominance. And the same, for example, with other facial features. So, for example, the width of your face is associated with tendencies toward to be more dominant, and more narrow faces are associated with tendencies to be less dominant. The idea and main argument is that there are individual differences in, for example, testosterone that influence these facial features. And so the facial features are one indication about the testosterone levels, and therefore the level of, for example, aggression, or the predisposition towards aggression that you can infer from this information. And it's also the where information is being revealed. So there's this very curious little study by Robinson and colleagues, um, appropriately entitled The Dual Nature of the Human Face. There's a little Jekyll and a little Hyde in all of us. What they did is they obscured parts of the face and then measured how much people would trust individuals. So if you, for example, show people the eyes, that typically correlates with more trustworthiness. Also, if you unblur, for example, the edges of your mouth, that also often, like signals more trustworthiness. So mouth and eyes provide information about trustworthiness, which is often seen as an important aspect of prestige. And on the other hand, the forehead and the chin are often associated with information related to dominance. Again, the argument is because those facial features are correlated with testosterone levels. And in their study, they also, like used, like faces, did all sorts of filtering with faces, and one of the faces that they used just to illustrate the pervasiveness of the effect is they used the face of Obama and showed the face with various filters where either Obama's face was all a little bit hazy, so out of focus, or only the eyebrows were in focus, or only the mouth and nose were in focus, or like manipulating basically the information that was in focus, and then asking people how much they would trust Obama, or how dominant they thought Obama was. And the interesting information, independent of the political orientation, just these simple filters shifted the ratings slightly in line with these kind of information features that are available to individuals. So the argument here is that facial features provide some basic heuristic about whether individuals might be trustworthy, so could be higher on prestige leadership, or might be more dominant. And here are some other examples. So for example, they used pictures of Bush versus Kerry. So Bush's face being a little bit wider, so supposedly indicates a bit more um, dominant aggressive strategy, and Kerry, the unsuccessful Democratic candidate, slightly narrow face and supposedly less dominant. And so they morphed these facial features with random other pictures, and then asked people whether they would trust these individuals to lead them through either a war or a peace political situation. And what you can see here in panel A, in a war situation, people were more likely to vote for a face that was morphed with Bush's face. And here the argument is, because it is more directly signals more directly kind of dominant, aggressive behavioral strategies, whereas in a peaceful environment, people were more likely to prefer faces that were merged with Kerry's face. And they did the same thing with masculinized and femininized features. So again, changing, for example, the eyebrows and the width of the face, and also parts of the mouth. And again, what you can see is more masculinized faces tend to be preferred in a war scenario, and more feminine faces tend to be preferred in a more peaceful political scenario. So quite interesting. I always find it fascinating that even such subtle shifts, if you don't have any other information, can trigger some shifts towards specific candidates that seem to signal certain behavioral tendencies. And the argument here is from an evolutionary psychology perspective that in a war scenario, you typically would want a leader who is aggressive, dominant, and can coordinate the group to effectively crush the enemy, whereas in a peaceful scenario, what you're more interested in is a leader that you can trust and admire, and that can lead you through all these kind of problem solving issues that you need to confront in a less dramatic, more peaceful environment. And here the issue of Trump comes back in. Here's a study that was published shortly after Trump was elected. So Herman Kakar and Neuro Sivanathan, they did some research in the lead up to the elections of Trump. And the interesting thing about this study, as we will see in a second, is it starts linking these evolutionary psychology dynamics to insights from behavioral ecology. So bridging two of the different evolutionary approaches that we have discussed right in the beginning of term. By the way, also, whenever you see this little question mark here, pay careful attention to the section that comes now, because that might appear in your test at the end of term. So great study, and let's have a look at some of the key findings. So what they did is they asked one sample of people how much each of the two candidates, so Clinton and Trump, how much they would be a prestige versus how high were they in terms of prestige versus dominance. And as you can see, Clinton was rated much higher in terms of prestige, whereas Trump was rated much higher in terms of dominance. And then what they did is they started looking at voting and rating, both ratings and voting intentions, and they asked people to report their zip code. And through linking their zip code to officially available statistics, they were able to identify areas where unemployment was higher, levels of poverty were higher, and vacant housing levels, so abandoned housing, were also higher. So these are, in the argument of the authors, these are indicators of environmental certainty versus uncertainty. Because if you don't have a job, there's high level of poverty and a lot of buildings are abandoned. This creates situational environmental uncertainty, which then should create a certain motivation for a more dominant or aggressive leader. So what they did is they looked at ratings for local politicians in the US and controlled for all sorts of variables, so gender, age, income, how long people have been living in a specific zip code area, how they identify politically, population levels, population density, and how many zip codes there are in the county. And then what they examined after that is whether individuals preferred either a prestige or a dominant leader in their voting intentions. And what you can see here is under situations of economic uncertainty, so in a context where uncertainty was higher, so there was more unemployment and more poverty, people started to prefer a dominant leader and started to express less likelihoods to vote for a prestige leader. So one thing that you have to remember here is these effects are small. These effects are tiny. As you can see, just the control variables here explain about 4.6% of the variance. And then if we add the economic uncertainty to the model, that explains another 4%. Sorry, less than a percent here. And the same happens for dominance. So overall, the control variables already explain more variance, so 9.5%, and so 0.2% is added by economic uncertainty. These effects are tiny, yet we have to think about that the election that we were looking at was one with a relatively small margin. As you remember, Trump won in the electoral colleges, but Clinton won in terms of absolute number of votes. But the margins in specific areas were rather small. And so these dynamics, even though they are relatively small and minor, can actually make some significant difference at the political level. They also then tested that more broadly with data from the World Value Survey. So they used a large sample from 69 countries, and they looked at their dependent variable, this specific item that has been included, essentially, like a proxy for a dominant leadership strategy. And the independent variable that they looked at was change in unemployment, so changes towards greater or lesser uncertainty in the economic environment. And the individual level mediator that they ask about is how much control do people actually feel that they have over their life. And what they found is that changes in unemployment were associated with increases or decreases in personal control, which then led to a preference for a more dominant or authoritarian leader. And so what we have to think about here is, what are possible identity processes? How do groups or leaders potentially activate group coalitions in order to get the relevant support to govern? And so if you think about it, this actually, from from a rational perspective, you would expect that leaders should be interested in creating more employment, right? But then on the other hand, this evidence here seems to suggest that actually unemployment can increase the support for authoritarian leaders in specific conditions. And they also looked at the moderating effect of national pride and whether that strengthened the effect of personal control or lessened the effect of personal control on dominant leaders. Really interesting, in their supplementary experimental, in the supplement, they reported some experimental data, again linking the zip code data, so the behavioral ecology information, to the likelihood of choosing a dominant leader, but they included an intervention, and the intervention was asking people to write about a situation where they had some personal control over events, or a situation where they felt out of control. And the interesting finding from this experiment is that it was individuals that were primed to think about situations where they did not have control about their lives and were living in highly economically uncertain environment. Those were most likely to report that they would vote or support a dominant leader. It's exactly those individuals that most suffer from the policies of a dominant, self-interested leader and feel uh, disempowered and without control, that are more likely to support than these individuals again. And let's have a quick look also at the second problem that people have to resolve, which is distributing resources. So we already saw that resource distributions have an impact on what kind of leaders people might prefer in specific situations. And I just want to briefly come back to two studies by Michael Bang Peterson and Lena Arroy's group. One, which has to do with Hunger Games, has to do with the fluctuations in blood sugar that we have, and these fluctuations, as you can imagine, in situations where you are hungry, you're probably more likely to prefer some policies or political strategies that distribute resources. At the same time, though, you are probably less likely to actually share with others if you receive some kind of government handout, for example. So the argument here is that Lena Arroy and Michael Bank Peterson that they put forward is that metabolic homeostasis, so the very basic needs in terms of food, can influence again how people want resources distributed within society. And it explains why in situations of scarcity and more increased hunger, you might have some paradoxical situations where people support redistribution, yet they also are less likely to share with others. And there are also other studies here on the right um, linked to specifically male competition, so male on male competition, where this group of researchers conducted a study across a number of Western societies, and they looked at who would be more likely to support politics for, or like policies of redistribution of economic resources. And they thought about that an important variable that is important, or that is evolutionary important, is strength. Back in our evolutionary past, if you were stronger and faster, you were probably more likely to prevail in dominance contests because it was strength based, and at the same time you were also probably able to, in that case, to create a stronger fighting coalition in order to increase your social status. So what they looked at is they measured the arm strength of male participants and then looked at where they are within the social hierarchy of their respective society, and then they found that those individuals that were lower in the social hierarchy here, so going down towards minus 2 or minus 1.5, and had more strength, so like had a larger upper body strength, they were more in favor of support. They were more in favor of economic redistribution. On the other hand, those individuals who had high socioeconomic status, so they are currently benefiting from the system and had more upper body strength, so like greater fighting ability, they reported less support for economic redistribution because they benefited from the system, right? So this shows again how social hierarchies can be shaped by both ancestral logics about coalition strength and fighting ability, and then influence support for specific economic policies. So both metabolic homeostatic needs as well as coalition or fighting abilities that were relevant and important in our ancestral environment can provide subtle shifts towards economic policies in a modern environment. So again, this is something we will probably look at in a bit more detail, or we will require to look at in a bit more detail for the test, and there will be a separate little activity on the Hunger Games study. So the preliminary summary is there are dominance versus prestige leaders. The interesting argument from an evolutionary psychology perspective is that we can pick up cues about possible leadership strategies from facial features. The argument is that it might be driven by predispositions and, for example, hormonal levels like testosterone. And these features, this information can shift preferences at a subtle level in specific conflict situations. So if a group is facing an enemy, typically, ancestrally speaking, you would be better off with a leader that is aggressive and dominant and can challenge and hopefully defeat the enemy. Whereas in more peaceful situations, you're probably better off with a more prestige-oriented leader that is less aggressive. The interesting thing, the study on the election of Trump also shows that these evolutionary dynamics need to be understood within the resource conditions and the uncertainty conditions within modern day environments. So linking behavioral ecology ideas to evolutionary psychology ideas. And concerning the second adaptive problem, the resource distribution, the insights from evolutionary psychology suggest that ancestral cues on, for example, coalition formidability, so fighting strength, and also metabolic homeostatic needs, so blood glucose levels, can shift support for certain social welfare policies. And so again, the idea here is that our brains, our bodies, were evolutionary adapted to specific environments that are mismatched to the requirements of modern democratic institutions.